make a start. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Lauren Long. For those of you who haven't listened to any of my webinars before, I'm a HR consultant at HPC, and today we're going to be discussing restructures and redundancies as a result of COVID-19. We've decided to put on this webinar because I know obviously there's been so many queries coming through about, you know, how the workplace will look after the lockdown eases, and I know that it's impacted so many businesses and there's a lot of change to be made. So hopefully this will give you a good understanding of what you need to do to address some of those shortcomings. And also, if you just have any questions afterwards, obviously let me know. But if you think that there's anything that you'd need to know at the time as we're going through, then that's absolutely fine. Just shout that out. And it might be worth making notes as well, because I know that for restructures and redundancies, they're very unique to your organisation. So this advice isn't sort of a catch-all. So there may be things that you want to note down and maybe pick up with me afterwards. Okay, so today's talking points we're going to go through are the workforce analysis, restructures, what might this look like, redundancies, what are my options, selection, fairness and consistency in the process, the consultation, and then finally the implementation. So the first point, if we look at the workforce analysis, I think it's really important, obviously, that you do carry out a detailed analysis of the existing workforce. I know that some people know that they need to make cuts or they need to cut back straight away, but I think it's really important that you do make the analysis of the resource that you've got in the workforce before making any of those decisions, because the last thing that you want is to delete a lot of posts and then that have further impact on the business. So it's really important that you carry out a very detailed analysis of the existing workforce, look at what roles that you've got in place, and see really what plan you want to make moving forward. It might be that you need to trim some fat in the business. So some people may have the luxury of having some additional resources. You know, it might be an extra admin, it might be somebody to support another role. I think it's really important that you, at this time, you have a look at what your core functions are and what those core roles are. And if there is anything around the outside that you feel like it may be necessary to strip back or reduce, those are probably the first things that you need to look at before you do start looking at your core workers really. Can you identify any ways to improve operational efficiency? I think this is really important because I know that naturally a lot of people do default to just think, well, the first thing needs to go is staff, but actually there are other ways that you can look at improving your operational efficiency, and it may still mean that you need to restructure or make redundancies. That's a really important part of this, because that will form your business case going forward. There's going to be things that could potentially avert redundancy, and it's really important that you consider all of those. Can existing staff be trained and upskilled to maybe help bring in more revenue, or can any roles be merged? Sometimes I think we can have two roles with maybe people with equal skill set. It may be possible in some cases that you can maybe look at merging those roles together. And make informed decisions. Like I say, this is why the detailed analysis of the existing workforce and everything else that affects that, so all your operations, how you spend, everything needs to be really deeply considered, just because if you don't make informed decisions and you make sort of drastic or quick decisions without any detail behind it, we obviously, although this is an unprecedented time for everybody, we do still need to be mindful that claims after this point may follow, and I do think there'll probably be a bit of a push maybe from some practices where they'll try and ask people and encourage people to make those tribunal claims, because they might be a bit more aware that some organisations could maybe fall down at this point. So it's really important that you do make those informed decisions, you understand fully yourself the reason why you're doing it, and that will then form the justifiable reason as to why you've made these decisions, if they are ever to be challenged. If we look at restructure first, obviously this will look like, so many different things to many different organisations and many different teams, because it may be that you want to restructure by remaking the whole team, or you may just want to cut some things out. So it's really important in the first instance that you just look at your organisation chart, see what that looks like, and can you streamline that structure? Are you looking at that structure and seeing maybe too many managers? Are the people who do very similar roles? Is there just too many people? Could people report into less than one person? Can those teams be potentially merged together? So they're the things that you need to look at when you are considering a restructure. And some of the options that you have to consider are amalgamating roles. So like I say, merging those together, seeing, one person do the same role potentially. Flatten the hierarchy, like it may be that you have too many managers in place and actually there's not much of a need. If you've got people who are able to work autonomously, maybe you can reduce the headcount when it comes to the managers. Upskill staff to take on more responsibility. So like I say, it's when you're restructuring, it's not all just about making cuts and cutting people back. It could be actually, we've identified that we could generate more revenue in this part of the business, so we'll actually upskill our staff to help increase the revenue or any efficiencies. Change the hours or structure of a role. You don't always have to cut headcount, even though in some instances I expect that will be the case. It might just be that you change the hours of a role. Have you got that administrator working a full-time role that could potentially be part-time, or do you have a receptionist who maybe works outside of the the customer facing hours? Do they really need to be there for that long? Or the structure of a role. So is it currently servicing 3 parts of the business? Could it potentially service 5 parts of the business? Could you, with additional training, increase that employee's responsibility so that they can take on more work? Reduce the headcount, of course. This is something that many people will be considering at the moment. Like I say, just trimming some potentially excess fat and making sure that they've got everything streamlined. So reducing the headcount will form part of a restructure, and then creating new roles and deleting the existing posts. So it may be that when you do review the existing organisation chart, that you think actually that post isn't really serving as well as it could, or actually we've now identified a new way of working and we're going to create another role, and that person will potentially move into that role instead. Or obviously delete some existing posts, which leads us on nicely to talk about the redundancies. So obviously at this point, it's really important that you firstly identify which posts are no longer required. And is there one or more of those posts? If there is one or more of those posts, more than one, sorry, you need to be mindful that everybody with that same post will need to go in the pool. So you can't just decide that you're going to make Sandra in accounts redundant if she's got the same role as a peer. You need to make sure that both of them would be put at risk, and then you'll go through a selection criteria, which we'll go on to talk about. I think it's also important as well, when you are selecting people for the pool, that it's not just job title. So it's not just accounts manager, for example, that all them they go into the pool. It could be that their subordinates could go into the pool as well, because there could be an argument from the account manager, for example, that, well, actually we should all be in the pool because I would take up, I would drop a level and I would be willing to take up that my subordinate role because I'm actually able to do that role. So it's really important that when you are selecting and identifying those posts, you think about whether anybody else could do any of those other roles. So like I say, if there's people above or below some people in the similar position, you'll need to consider putting all them in, unless you can really identify that they can't be included. So who goes into the redundancy pool? Like I say, you need to really make sure that you fully consider that, because being too selective about who goes in the pool will cause you difficulty later on. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, though, if you have got if you're potentially making 90% of the workforce redundant, and all kinds of roles are going into the pool, but you have identified that one of the roles or a couple of the roles are absolutely business critical and cannot be subject to redundancy, then as long as you can identify and justify that those roles should be ring fenced, because without that role you absolutely couldn't function, then you're also fine to ring fence them. But ring fencing is quite a complex situation. So if you do have any situations where you do feel like ring fencing may be an option, just make sure that you run it by us. The objective, I think this is probably from my personal experience where most organisations possibly fall down. That could be because in the past they may have tried to use redundancy as a way to exit somebody out of the business, which isn't uncommon. But it's really important that you remember it's the post that you're making the redundant, not the person. And for people who potentially go at this with a person in mind, you're liable to fall short, because it then becomes very subjective. It can become quite personal, and it's absolutely critical that that is not the case. So just bear in mind when you are making these decisions and deciding who's going to go into the pool, you're very clear in your own head that it's the post that's being made redundant, so the person's got absolutely nothing to do with it. So don't use this as a way to performance manage people out of the business either, because that's, again, a very different thing, and that's where a lot of organisations can sometimes cross wires, and then it starts to get messy, because believe it or not, the person starts to understand and feel that it is personal, and then that just leaves you liable to a claim. And don't discriminate. So this is quite a tricky one, because I know that a lot of people think, may naturally think, if there's part-time workers in the business, well, we can just get rid of them because we can cope without them, because they potentially only do 15 hours a week and they're the first people that should go. That really can't be the case, because part-time workers have the right not to be discriminated against for their part-time status. So it's really important that you don't just sort of, when you're doing this analysis, you don't just quickly think, oh, I'll put all the part-time workers in. And if you are in a situation where, for example, a role in your business is actually occupied by a number of part-time workers, and that's the only role that you are considering deleting, then that's fine, but you just need to make it very clear and make sure that you have got a business case for making all those part-time workers redundant. So you couldn't put a part-time worker in the pot who has the same role as a full-time worker, for example. So selection, you will need to determine how you will select from the pool, so not who you will select, but how. It's really important, and this becomes a selection criteria. So you have a couple of options here. You could either use a skills matrix, which is very common, or in some cases a competitive interview may be more suitable. So if you look at the skills matrix, this is just an example of a skills matrix, and how you would sort of determine them. It's basically like a scoreboard, essentially. So you'd have your criteria along the top. So this is just an example of some things that you can use. Could be absence, disciplinary, quality of work, quantity of work, technical knowledge of the service or product, customer relationships, level of supervision required, and the ability to meet deadlines, because this will effectively weed out anybody who you feel isn't supporting the business the way it needs to. So the people who score the highest will be the people who will remain in the business, and the other posts will be made redundant. But when you are deciding what to put in the skills matrix, you don't have to include all those things that are in front. They're just suggestions. Be mindful about what will be relevant. So if nobody in that team has got a disciplinary record, or only one person has got a disciplinary record, and the others and everybody else scores the same on the others, then that may be a bit unfair. So maybe look at things that you can very evenly spread out. So absence, is there a number of people who have absence issues? And then obviously they're the objective things, are very tangible. So absence and disciplinary, quantity of work, if that's measurable. If you're going to use subjective stuff, so the technical knowledge, customer relationships, level of supervision, I'd always recommend putting a blend of them together. So I would never rely on just subjective criteria, because you've probably got more chance of that being challenged if you've got a manager mark on somebody, 1 out of 5 on the customer relationships. It's obviously subject to some opinion. So it's helpful for you in terms of strengthening your case if you have a blend, so like absence record, disciplinary, and some subjective things. And then obviously the individuals who score the lowest out of that will be selected for redundancy. I think it's worth noting as well, if you're going to use absence, if you're going to include that in your skills matrix, make sure that those absences don't leave somebody with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage. So things such as pregnancy-related absence or any disability-related absence, you couldn't rely on that as being part of the score without it being discriminatory. So just if you have any cases of pregnancy-related or disability-related absences, I'd just omit them for the purpose. You can include all the other absences that person has, but for the purpose of this skills matrix, I would just omit those. Competitive interview. So in some cases, it might be more appropriate to use a competitive interview process to determine who is best for the post. So this could be maybe in a situation where you have 2 people and you're changing the role, or you're amalgamating those roles into one. You may determine that actually, either of them have got an absence record or a disciplinary record, and skill level and customer relationships or whatever are pretty similar, so that won't really help us. So we think, we want to know who's going to be best, who's going to be the better performer going forward in this particular post. So therefore, you'll use a competitive interview. It would be recommended in situations, like I said before, where individuals wouldn't be distinguished by scores. So if you've got a situation where everybody's coming out pretty similar, then you may think. So it would be appropriate to use this in cases where an employee's disability-related absence record will put them at a disadvantage. So like I say, if you've got all those people scored and somebody with a disability, who could also argue that they maybe haven't performed as well over the last couple of months because they've had a lot of disability-related absences, I would tread carefully there and maybe go for competitive interview. So fairness and consistency, this is really critical when considering the process for restructures or redundancies. Like I say, I'd just like to reiterate that it is the post that you're making redundant and not the person. When determining the selection criteria, ensure that this does not put anyone with a protected characteristic, i.e. disability or age, at a disadvantage. Don't include disability or pregnancy-related absence in a selection criteria. And ensure consistency in the process. So if you're having somebody doing the scoring or the interviews, it's really important that you make sure that it's the same person or panel that scores everybody, because there could be an argument if one manager scores one person and the other manager scores another person. That's going to be quite subjective. So make sure that that's consistent across the board. And the same with the interviews. If you're doing competitive interviews, I know that interviews tend to spiral off and can sometimes go a bit informal, and you can ask other questions, which is fine, but you really need to make sure that when you base the interview on the scoring, and so the questions set out equally for everybody before you set off, just to make sure that everybody's at an equal advantage. So the consultation. Consultation is an absolutely critical part of the process, and a failure to consult when making post redundant or changing roles will be liable for automatic unfair dismissal. So it's really important that you get this part of the process right. Obviously we can help support and guide you further with this on an individual basis, but it's just really important that we understand before you do make any decisions or communicate anything what this consultation process looks like. So you should inform employees that their roles are at risk as early as possible. Now, this is a requirement that as soon as a business understands that redundancies could be possibly coming, they should, where practicable, inform employees. So, that's not for us to just sit and think, oh, well, we could run out of cash flow soon. So we'll just put everybody at risk, because you obviously need to be mindful that putting people at risk causes a lot of anxiety, and the uncertainty around the process is difficult. But if you can take you know, an informed decision and think, oh, actually we've looked at our cash flow, or you know, whatever, and we've actually realized that we are going to be at risk of some redundancies, posts will have to go. At that point, you should put people on notice that their roles are at risk. You can also do this during the furlough process. So if employees are furloughed, you're still able to consult with them during this time, because obviously we understand that it could be problematic if you have people on furlough, bring them back, and then you don't have the wages to sustain their employment for a further 2 months, for example, while the consultation process goes on. So you can do that while they're on furlough. And I had some clarity from our legal team yesterday that you can still furlough people who are in the notice of redundancy. So hopefully that's useful. So you must formally notify the employees that you are putting their role at risk, and let them know that you will be starting the consultation period. So it's really important that they get that formal notification, you know, whether that's via email or letter or telephone. It must be formal, and you also must make sure that you include everybody who may potentially be affected. Sometimes a lot of people run the risk of somebody who's perhaps on maternity leave or adoption or paternity leave, and they don't include them because they think they shouldn't be bothered. That's quite the opposite. If those people are at risk, or anything to do with their team, you know, is going to be affected, or their roles may be affected, you need to consult with them while they're on leave. That can be done at, you know, if it's not face to face, that can be done via writing as well, which I imagine will be the case for a lot of people in the lockdown. So the consultation period is what follows the first notification meeting, and basically it's just a time for employees to consider the information that you've given them, and it's an opportunity for them to make suggestions and provide feedback. So once you've made that formal notification, tell everybody that they are, you know, at risk. The consultation period is a bit of a grace period, really, to allow employees to digest that information and to maybe come back to you with some suggestions. So it may be that they say, you know, we're considering deleting one post, and the employee comes back and says, well, actually, you know, me and my colleague are actually willing to job share. So rather than make one of us redundant, can we both take up that post on a job share basis? They may also say, well, actually, I've identified a different cost saving in the business. Have you considered this? So it's a good time for both employee and employer, really, because there may be things that you haven't thought of that your employees may suggest during the consultation period, which obviously will help mitigate your risk if you've taken them on board. And I think we're all guilty of sometimes, you know, assuming that that person wouldn't want that role, or that person's at this stage in their career, so we don't think this would be suitable, or, you know, that person's potentially going off to have a baby, so I don't think she's going to want a promotion. And, you know, it's all those things that you need to get out of your mind, really, and use the consultation periods as a time to just let employees come forward with what they are actually feeling. So carefully consider any suggestions to avert redundancy. So things like job share, reduced hours and reduced pay. It's really important that you can demonstrate, if you are going to say that those don't work, why they won't work. Because if you just ignore those suggestions and don't really give a business reason or any justifiable reason as to why they won't work, again, you could be at risk of a claim for this being unfair. Also, I think a key point here is, when we're looking at making roles redundant, it's a potential. So we're potentially making these roles redundant, and obviously we all hope to avert that where possible. So that's why it's really important that when people do make those suggestions, you do carefully consider them and give them you know, a response back to those suggestions that they've made, because what you don't want it looking like is that you've already made your mind up that this person's going to be made redundant, and actually you're just going through this consultation process as a means to an end that would show up really bad in a court case. There's a requirement in law that the consultation must be genuine and meaningful, and by shutting down suggestions and not giving staff the opportunity to put forward any feedback and considering those, could result in them arguing that it wasn't genuine or meaningful. You have just set up a process for the sake of a process. So it's really important that you do take that time. Consult with employees that are absent, like I've just said, on maternity, paternity, or adoption leave, because those employees will still need to be included, and it will be automatically unfair dismissal if you don't consult with any of them. And for the likes of a lady on maternity leave, she's probably one of the most protected when it comes to the legislation. So it's really critical that you make sure that you are keeping them in the loop. And the post is at risk and only potentially redundant until the final decision is made. I think using those words during the consultation period are also very important. So you're making it clear and you're communicating to the individuals that this is just a potential. It's an avenue that you're having to explore, that reluctantly, but you'd welcome any suggestions that they make to potentially avert it. So this is what an example of what this could look like in terms of the structure. So you'd have the first meeting where you notify them that the roles are at risk and there's a situation in the business that needs addressing. You'd then have the consultation period. During this period, you will, if people do submit their suggestions, I think it's worth bearing in mind, I wouldn't set yourself up for too much of a time frame. So while it can be very easy to in your head, have a plan and say, okay, I'll have the consultation period. I'll have the first meeting on Monday. The consultation period will run till Thursday, and then I'll have the second meeting. I think, be mindful of the process and the fact that it could be a gradual process, because if 20 of your staff submit, and I've actually seen this before, 10-page documents on how the business can save money to avert redundancies, you're going to have to take the time to read all of them and respond to them. So while it's obviously ideal for us to have time frames in mind of how quickly we would like these things to conclude, if you commit yourself to those time frames, you may then trip yourself up by not taking careful consideration. During that consultation period, you will share the selection criteria or the interview method that you're going to use with the staff, because it's important that they have the opportunity to feed back on that and make you aware of anything that they're challenging. So it could be that they say, well, actually, you've appointed this manager to hold these interviews or to score me, but I've recently put in a grievance about that manager, so I don't think this is fair. Or, some of my absences were disability related, so I don't think this scoring mechanism is fair. So it's all of those things that they will, you give the employee the opportunity to review that and to challenge it, because that will help you if they identify something that you haven't. Again, that's mitigating your risk. And if they come back with suggestions and you determine that actually no, you don't agree with their feedback or the suggestions, you are confident that it's fair, and you can press ahead as long as you've got reason to. You don't have to change everything unless you feel that there's a need to. You'll then confirm with them the selection criteria, apply it, so score them and hold the interviews, and then you'll have the final meeting. And at that meeting, that's when you will say, we've considered everything that you've put forward, or if you haven't put anything forward, there's nothing else to consider. We've applied the selection criteria, or we've held the interviews, and these are the scores. And then you'll make a decision at that meeting, and you'll inform people that either they are dismissed by way of redundancy because they scored lowest, or they've retained their post, or they'll be taking up a new post. This process, it can be fairly short in time. It could run over a period of 2 weeks for a couple of individual employees, but when the number increases, there's some different considerations. So if I just share this with you, again, this probably won't affect, or hopefully won't affect the majority of us, but if it is, and something that will affect you, then you just let me know afterwards. Because if we look at this, for more than 20 employees, you need to give 30 days notice. So that consultation period with the staff will be 30 days. So from the day that you have that first meeting, it will be 30 days after before you can confirm the redundancy. And for 100 employees, it's 45 days notice. When you have a larger number of employees, it becomes a collective consultation. So you wouldn't meet with 20 employees individually to notify them. You'd collectively consult. So you would make an announcement, and then if anybody has any trade union representatives, you can let them be involved where possible. They don't, obviously, they're not there to obstruct the course of the process, but they will have the right to be represented. So it's important that you allow that. You then need to elect employee representatives. So this will be maybe a person from each department, perhaps, that their peers vote for, who they will nominate to consult with you as management on their behalf. So rather than you having 20 meetings or a collective meeting over the finer detail stuff with 20 employees all the time, you would just meet with their representatives, have the meeting, have the discussions. They will give you their feedback from their teams, and then they will go back and relay all the information to the teams. At the end of that, you will obviously need to still have the final consultation meetings with individuals who will be made redundant, but the first part of that process will be done on an employee representative basis. Another thing to consider, and this is only usually relevant in larger organisations where there's a larger number affected, but it could be relevant in yours, especially if you do have more than one post. Maybe consider volunteers for redundancy. So if there's anybody who you think may volunteer for redundancy, then open that up. And if you're in a situation where you've got 5 of the same role, it's actually always best to offer voluntary redundancy at the start, just because there could be an argument that you haven't really averted you've made compulsory redundancies, which could have been averted had you asked for volunteers. So obviously the final stage of this would be the implementation. So once you've had those, you've found your new people for your new posts, you've potentially deleted some roles and made things redundant in the team, and the workforce looks very different. There's a few considerations at this stage. So will you offer a trial period into the new role? If somebody has been made redundant and either offered a suitable alternative or a new role, you are able to put in a trial period of up to a month, which gives you and the employee a time to see whether that role works for them and works for you, because you don't want to be in a situation where you've put somebody in a role and 4 weeks later you realise that they're really not going to work in this role, and then have to performance manage them, because obviously with the uncertainty that's already been, it would be terrible for morale. So I think offering a trial period into that new role is a great benefit for them and you, to say, yeah, this is working, or no, potentially it's not, so we're going to have to make you redundant. And be mindful of the impact of the change. So it's not only the people who have been made redundant that are impacted, it's obviously the rest of the team as well. That amount of uncertainty and the fact that they've seen job losses will impact them and their well-being. So it's important that you are mindful about that and be transparent and as open as possible about why these changes have been made, if redundancies have been made, and what the business is going to do to stop them in the future. Or if you feel that further redundancies may follow, make people aware that the business is going through a difficult time, so that they're aware and you are being transparent. And you also need to be mindful of like survivor's guilt, which a lot of people who have averted redundancy will say that they have, where they feel guilty that their peers have gone. So generally morale can be a bit low at that time. Support individuals in their new roles. So do they need additional training? If you've asked somebody to take on additional workload, or you've put them in a new role altogether, or amalgamated some roles, do they need additional training? Is there any support that they'll need to make sure that they do continue to perform? And just to make you aware, in any case of a dismissal, there's always a risk of an unfair dismissal claim arising. With redundancy, it's a very intricate process. It can be very technical, so it's really important that you do seek advice from us at each stage of that process, and make sure that you take heed on some of the points that I've raised, things like making sure you're objective, and making sure that you consult with everybody and follow the process, because even if you get to a tribunal, the tribunal essentially don't really care why you've made those decisions, as long as you can present the business case for it, but how you made those decisions and how you got to where you are today is something that they will consider. So even if everything appeared fair and was genuine and meaningful on the outset, if you fall down at any stage of that process, you've got a good chance of that being deemed unfair. So it's really important that you just, take note of those things and just keep us in touch with any changes that you do plan to make, and we can support you on an individual basis. And that is everything from me today. So thank you for joining. I hope you found it useful. If anybody's got any questions now that they feel would be useful to ask in a forum, then let me know. If not, just drop us an email and I can help you further. Has anybody got any questions for now?
I've got one, Lauren.
Yeah.
In terms of the consultation period, and we talked about consider any suggestions to avert redundancy.
Yeah.
The idea of reduced hours or reduced pay, the likelihood, because we're a golf club and we're going to have a bar that's not going to be open for probably 5-6 months, administration, which is just going to be a skeleton, which will be me. What situation are we in with those people where we've already seen kind of the furlough's going to extend till the end of June, and we'll know in probably another week whether or not they'll extend it on, but somewhere along the line they're going to pull the furlough payments.
Yeah.
Where do we stand, because it's already been suggested by the group that I'm working with, of reducing the pay of our staff based on obviously no work. Legally, how do we stand on that?
So you've got a couple of options there, really, Gary. If there's absolutely no work at all, if you've got a layoff clause in your contract after the furlough period, because obviously furlough was just brought in as an unprecedented measure to support businesses, but for those with a layoff clause in the contract, which I think you may have, you would be able to lay them off without pay. But you just need to be mindful that anything over 4 weeks could be challenged as a redundancy situation. So it could be that you need to make them redundant. The other option that you've got, if you were to reduce pay, is again going through a similar consultation process as you would by redundancy, but asking people to consent to a pay cut, basically. So you'd go through that process, you'd consult with them, explain the reasons why, propose that they take this pay cut. If they volunteer to agree to this and they do consent, that's fine. You just get it in writing and you get them a new contract. If anybody doesn't, you do have the option of unilaterally forcing the change. So you would say, okay, well, we're serving you notice now, basically, that your existing contract will cease, and you will be re-engaged on these new terms on whatever date is the last day of their notice period in the contract. And basically you're basically saying your contract's finished, we propose to re-engage you on these new terms, and if they show up on that first day of the new engagement, it's deemed that they've accepted those changes. However, if they don't turn up, it's probably likely that they could put in an unfair dismissal claim. But as long as you've got a good business case for that and you've followed a very good process, you should be fine.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Has anybody else got any questions?
Lauren, I just had a question. Does this apply to employees who've been working under 2 years?
Which, sorry, the redundancy?
Yeah, so I've got somebody who just started just before the furlough, just before everything happened, who's now furloughed. But
yeah, so you won't need to go through a full redundancy process if you don't wish to, if people have got less than 2 years service. But it's worth bearing in mind that if they've got any protected characteristics, you will still need to follow a fair process. And so in those cases, it may be that redundancy is a fair process, you know, will demonstrate that you are going through a fair process. But for those without any protected characteristics under 2 years, no, you wouldn't need to go through that process. But if you need any individual help with that, then just let us know.
Sure. And just one more question, if possible.
Yeah.
I imagine it perhaps isn't something that you can take into consideration, but I've got 2 people doing the same role who have a vastly different pay. You know, they're paid at very different levels, and so obviously for the business, that will be a really key factor to us. That saving the higher level of pay would be helpful. But can that be considered?
Yeah, it's actually really important that you do that, because if you've got 2 people operating at the same level but on different pay, you're liable there for an equal pay claim anyway. So it's really important that you do even that out. So you could even
the reason for it is one's based in London.
So London weighting, yeah.
It's got a London weighting, but of course from the bottom line of the business, you know, that London weighting doesn't mean very much to us at the moment. Yeah,
well, you can still just go through the same process. So would you be wanting to reduce the person with the higher pay? Yeah, so you just go through the same process that I've just described. You just meet with them, explain that you propose that they make a pay cut, they take a pay cut due to obviously unprecedented business needs, and consult with them on it, get their feedback, see what they say. If they agree to it, that's great, and if they don't, you do have the potential of dismissing them and re-engaging them on new terms.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful, thanks.
Okay, has anybody else got any questions? No? Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks everybody for joining. I hope you found it useful. And like I say, if you do have any more questions, you've got my number or my email, so just get in touch. Have a great day, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Lauren.
All right, bye.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.